So, Pawan, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. So, I'm very happy to have Pawan here. And it's taken a while, even though we've known each other for almost 3 years now, that I could persuade him to come to find a slot for us. And so a few words about Pawan. Pawan is professor at MIT in Brain and Cognitive Sciences, and he had his training in computer science and is now mainly focusing on vision, computational vision. And Pawan is mostly renowned for his project Prakash. And Prakash for Indian people means light, meaning studying, seeing light in children in India who are born with cataracts, that is without sight, and then not only providing humanitarian help with surgery for getting operation, but also then using this opportunity to study how vision develops in children that gain sight at teenage years. So there is lots of work that I really don't know, but that is what Pawan is really famous for, received numerous prizes. I printed out what I sent out, and for the first time I needed 2 pages because the accomplishments are really very high. And I should say, the first time I saw you, and actually I did see you one more time giving a talk, which was at Neuroscience ages ago, where you gave one of those big talks with thousands of people in the audience. And I remember that very well. So aside from that, I should say that I had the very fortunate opportunity when I was at MIT for sabbatical to join your lab meeting, kind of word of mouth, there's something interesting going on.
Something crazy happening.
Something interesting going on, maybe. And that happened to Pawan was struggling with getting some data on movement control in children with autism. And I was there and I thought, that looks easy to me. I can do that in our lab. And it sort of complemented what technology that you didn't have, and then from that some collaboration emerged. So part of that will be here. So Pawan will talk about this work where I have a little snippet in there. That is the predictive impairment in autism hypothesis. And depending on how discussion goes, maybe at the end he will also have time to share something about his work on Project Prakash. And I don't forget my mug this time, so that you remember
Oh,
us.
wow. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you for this, and thank you for the very warm introduction, Dagmar. I hold you in such high esteem that hearing these very generous words from you carry a lot of weight. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to share some of our work. On my way over, I ran into Ennio Mingola, and he said that amongst all of the audiences that he has encountered, this audience is the most engaged, the most fun to talk to. So I'm really looking forward. So my lab is broadly interested in issues of development, normal development, atypical development, and also computational principles behind learning and development. And this work that I have the opportunity to present to you today, this is more the atypical development piece of it. We are still, I would say, we are still novices in the field of autism, still finding our way. But trying to understand what are the big questions, what has already been done, and where can we make some contribution. When I started learning about autism, what I realized was that some foundational issues about autism are still largely open. So by foundational, I mean even what we mean by autism. So when we talk about, say, amnesia, we can say that it's a disorder of memory, aphasia, a disorder of language. But when we talk about autism, we can't really make even that simple statement. So when we talk about autism, the best that we can do to the question of what is autism is to produce a list of symptoms associated with autism. And this is not, of course, a very satisfactory state of affairs, but this is what we as scientists and clinicians have to live with. In fact, the DSM-5 codifies this list of observations in terms of what are the things that you need to look for in order to arrive at a diagnosis for the condition. And there are three primary categories. So there's deficits in communication, deficits in social interactions, and restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior. And I call these the three islands of autism. And I'm using that term, islands, with the specific purpose of making a crude analogy to our style of thinking. So here are some actual islands. What islands are these? Sorry? Hawaii Islands. These islands, they superficially look quite different from each other. In fact, here's a quote from a travel website. Each of the major islands has a personality all its own. Oahu is as different from Molokai and Maui as Kauai is from Lanai and the Big Island. So superficially, these regions look quite different, but if you look a little deeper, then they all arise from similar causal factors. And the question that we are asking in the domain of autism has a similar flavor to it. Do the islands of autism share some commonalities? It may eventually turn out that they don't, that these three things are truly distinct, as several researchers have hypothesized. But I think it behooves us as scientists to try to see whether there are some things that connect these seemingly disparate aspects of autism. So in undertaking this exploration, we first turned to looking at each of these domains on its own, and then seeing whether there were some commonalities in the way each of these domains has been treated. So what I'm going to do in the talk is to first present to you a hypothesis that we came up with, what we like about the hypothesis, and what we aren't quite satisfied with about this hypothesis. And when I say we, it's a fairly large list of people. Here are a few of them, and I should highlight the wonderful collaborations that we have been able to start at Northeastern with Dagmar, Siwong, many other members of her lab, with Margaret and Nouchine at MGH and MGH IHP, and several people at MIT. So back to considering these domains of the diagnostic domains of autism. Each of these domains has been the subject of significant research, and these are quite literally just the tips of the big icebergs. So rich fields, but in looking through these mostly computational investigations of these domains, what stands out is that one of the favorite formalisms that researchers have used in attacking or in understanding these domains is the Markov systems formalism, the notion of a few states that are connected by probabilistic links. And in order to perform well in any of these domains, you essentially have to estimate the Markov system that underlies that domain. And if you are able to do a good job with that estimation, then you will be able to function reasonably well. Otherwise, you will find challenges. So what is the key computational requirement in order to estimate the Markov system that underlies a given domain? Well, here's a key one. So based on a bunch of observations of a state transitioning to another state with some delay, we would like to be able to estimate this conditional probability as a function of time. So what is the likelihood of event B transpiring after event A has happened as a function of the amount of time that you're observing this? If there are problems in estimating these conditional probabilities, there's going to be a fundamental problem in estimating the whole system. So this leads us to the PIA, the predictive impairment and autism hypothesis, that perhaps autism is accompanied by impairments in estimating this conditional probability. And graphically, inspired by the contrast sensitivity function in vision, we are representing relationships between events in this two-dimensional space where the y-axis is the strength of the relationship and the x-axis is the time that elapses between the two events. And this is a hypothesized or a hypothetical association sensitivity function. So relationships in the lower right corner of the space are the difficult relationships to discern because the strength of the relationship is weak and B is happening a long time after A has transpired. These relationships, on the other hand, are easy relationships because the strength is high, so B consistently happens after A, and the time interval between the two is small. So these relationships might be undetectable. These are the detectable ones. And again, akin to the contrast sensitivity function, maybe there is some kind of a threshold which defines the boundary between the detectable relationships and the undetectable relationships. And we call this the association sensitivity function. And our hypothesis is that perhaps autism is accompanied by a shift of this association sensitivity function to the up and left. So that some of the relationships that a neurotypical individual can detect become invisible to people with autism. So this is the basic kernel of the idea, and we described this in a paper a few years ago. We also call this hypothesis the magical world hypothesis, where with compromised prediction skills, an individual with autism inhabits a world where events seem to transpire without cause, without a rhyme or reason, and it seems like a capricious world, which can very quickly get to be aversive. So that's the basic hypothesis. Let's look at why we think that this hypothesis might have some merit. So in the work that we have undertaken so far and in the review of the empirical data that we have conducted, there seems to be some support for this idea. And I'm going to describe, time permitting, 3 lines of empirical work: perceptual processing, dynamic interception, which is probably of the greatest relevance to this audience, but also quite far away from my core competence. So I might ask Dagmar to chime in. And probabilistic reasoning. The reason we have selected these 3 subdomains in particular is because they nicely tile this space. So the dynamic interception work, those relationships are happening at short time intervals. Then you have perceptual processing at medium time intervals and probabilistic reasoning at longer time intervals.
Can you say anything about what those time magnitudes are?
So I would say, and I don't want to put too much specification when we ourselves don't really have very much specification, but I would say on the order of milliseconds here, or tens of milliseconds, seconds, and tenths of seconds, roughly. So this work is, of course, in collaboration with Dagmar, and the probabilistic reasoning work is in collaboration with Nouchine Hadjikhani at MGH. So let's start with perceptual processing. And the reason we gravitated to perceptual processing is because it's such a pronounced aspect of autism. According to some estimates, about 90% of all children on the spectrum have some kind of sensory atypicality, very often sensory hypersensitivities, as is evident in these pictures. So stimuli that to a neurotypical would seem completely benign, seem aversive to children on the spectrum, and these could be auditory, visual, tactile stimuli. Now, why might they be these sensory hypersensitivities? For a while, the hypothesis was that perhaps autism confers hyperacuity, true hyperacuity to the sensory apparatus and sensory processing, that these children actually are hyperacute, they have hyperacute sensory apparatus. And here are some pieces of evidence that seem to corroborate that idea. So here's a paper from Simon Baron Cohen's group titled Eagle-Eyed Visual Acuity, where the acuity of children on the spectrum seem to be just qualitatively different from the acuity of neurotypicals. In audition, similarly, there were reports that there are many more individuals with hyperacute audition relative to neurotypicals, and the same story with touch. And in the popular press as well, there was this idea that maybe individuals on the spectrum can sense things that a neurotypical cannot, as indicated in this quote. And not unlike a dog, the child with autism may actually hear things undetectable to your ear. In extreme examples, the child has been able to hear the heartbeats of others in the room. So if that were true, if autism is actually elevating this raw sensitivity of the sensory apparatus, then it makes sense that these children would exhibit hypersensitivity to sounds, be repulsed by stimuli that neurotypicals would find tolerable. But more systematic exploration of the sensory acuities seems to suggest that this is not the case. So for almost all of these reports of hyperacuity, there are controversies, and there are suggestions that those data might not be entirely reliable. And I'm not going to go through the rebuttals, but suffice it to say that this idea seems to be questioned. So better sensory thresholds are unlikely to account for the observed hypersensitivities in autism, which then brings us back to the question of how can we account for hypersensitivities? I mean, that's not in doubt. Children with autism do exhibit hypersensitivities. How can we account for it? Yes.
So, do these critical papers use standard psychophysical tests and standard psychophysical tests without the processing involved is what fails to see the differences in ASD?
Yes.
And it is not that a whole list of psychophysical tests, some of which are supportive of hypersensitivity and others are not.
No, so these tests, the rebuttals, are very often more sensitive than the original papers, and they find that despite that increase in sensitivity in their assessment, they are not finding what was reported in the earlier papers. So it's not that there are some aspects of sensory processing that one set of papers looked at, and then the rebuttals are looking at other aspects. even when you look at directly those aspects with greater sensitivity, you find that the results don't hold up.
And this is strictly sensory acuity, not anything else.
That's right. Yeah. So we can ask this question slightly differently. Instead of asking what makes individuals on the spectrum hypersensitive, we can ask what makes neurotypicals not hypersensitive. So how is it that we can keep working or not be averse to somebody producing the sound of a vacuum cleaner? And so many people like this picture very much. But setting aside the sociological aspects of the picture, so a big part of the answer as to what allows us to not exhibit hypersensitivity to these kinds of stimuli is habituation. Although initially we might be affected by the sound of the vacuum cleaner, over time we are able to damp it down. And habituation, of course, is a highly studied process. You find it in behavior, you find it in neural responses. So it's an old story and a very reliable one.
I think in this case the reason is because I don't see a power cord. I don't think it's plugged in.
Very good. So why are we interested in habituation as a possible explanation? What factors modulate habituation? So one of the big factors that modulates habituation is predictability. The less predictable an input sequence is, the lower the habituation. And this again is largely non-controversial. Many studies have looked at this, and there is a direct link between the predictability of the stimulus and the amount of habituation it evokes. Here's just one of those papers reporting results from mice. So exposing mice to mere temporal unpredictability within a time series of neutral sound pulses prevented rapid habituation of single neuron activity. So predictability has a very tight relationship to habituation. And this idea has sadly been misappropriated by some communities for devising better forms of torture. So acoustic bombardment torture apparently works best with unfamiliar sound stimuli. So if you just play music that's unfamiliar to a person and you keep playing it, that can become very, very aversive. So if we are hypothesizing that autism is accompanied by reduced predictability, reduced endogenous ability to predict what's going to happen next, then we would expect that there would be a reduction in the habituation that an individual on the spectrum would exhibit. And that's the experimental target for some of the work that we have done. So is habituation reduced in autism? So it's a fairly straightforward question in principle. So imagine that you have a stimulus that is, to a neurotypical, quite predictable, but we are now saying that there's an endogenous impairment in prediction, so that even this fairly regular sequence might seem unpredictable to a person on the spectrum. Does, say, something like a metronomic sequence, does that evoke lessened habituation in a person with autism? So we've asked that question using a few different recording modalities. We've looked at galvanic skin response, magnetoencephalography, and also EEG. And I'm going to give you brief vignettes of the results. So let's say you're listening to just a sequence of beeps coming one every second. And I'm recording your skin conductance. For a neurotypical, you would see this very steady habituation. So that's one individual, here 2 others, and here is an average across 18 individuals. So no surprises. Over about 4 or 5 minutes, you're seeing this beautiful habituation. What happens with individuals on the spectrum? So here are 3 individuals, and you notice that instead of habituation, you actually find sensitization. So here is the average across 18. So it seems to be a very consistent result. And these are individuals across a variety of ages and across a variety of functional levels. And yet, we find this pattern of reduced habituation.
Did you also question them afterwards whether they get agitated with this increased sensitivity?
Only informally, yeah. So we didn't, because some of them were not very verbal. So we didn't really, I don't have a well-defined answer for you.
Do you have a control, for example, for the neurotypicals when you did something else that would agitate them?
No, so we don't have that. In fact, so all that we're using the controls here for is to say that for that particular sequence, you get habituation. What we would really want to do is, with controls, vary the amount of predictability in the sequence. So move systematically away from complete periodicity and see whether that movement correlates with the reduction in habituation in controls. We haven't done that yet, but we are getting underway that work. So here are all of the participants individually. So what you're seeing here are the slopes of the GSR traces that you were just looking at. And you notice that for the neurotypical participants, for most of them, the slopes are negative or close to 0. Whereas for the ASD participants, for many of them, the slopes are either close to 0 or even positive. So there is a very pronounced group level difference in habituation. So when we began to see this clear difference between the 2 groups, it was almost too good to be true. I mean, because in autism, the results are notoriously heterogeneous. So we asked whether we could find some echoes of this result if we were to look directly at brain activity. And that took us to working with magnetoencephalography. We have an MEG system right in our building in BCS. And magnetoencephalography, I'm sure all of you know, is the close cousin to EEG, but instead of looking at electrical potential changes, you're looking at the magnetic field changes around the scalp. So the presentation is essentially the same as with GSR. The subject is sitting in the MEG chair and listening to a sequence of beeps, and we are recording their brain activity across multiple sensors. And what we would like to see is whether the amplitude of the activity elicited in the early part of the presentation differs systematically from the amplitude of the activity elicited later, so the evoked responses. Of course, the MEG data do not look clean like this. They look more like that. So you have to average several presentations to get to the evoked response. We do the averaging in the initial part of the sequence. We do the averaging towards the end of the sequence. And we can then compare this amplitude, this evoked response amplitude against that evoked response amplitude to see whether there is a change. And a reduction in that amplitude would correspond to habituation. So what do we find when we do this analysis? So with neurotypicals, here are two individuals. You find that there's a clear indication of habituation. The amplitude in the initial part of the sequence is greater than that in the later part of the sequence for this individual and also for that individual, and I'll show you more subjects in a moment. But now let's look at the data from individuals on the spectrum. So here are two of them. And you notice that, again, kind of like what we saw with GSR, there is an increase in the amplitude as the sequence proceeds.
I'm totally ignorant about MEG. Is there an area, or is that
Yes, so
over the entire brain?
No, so this is over the auditory cortex.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Can you briefly say the advantages and disadvantages of MEG versus EEG?
So MEG, firstly, it costs about $5 million. And EEG costs, a good system costs about $100,000.
Big advantage.
So MEG gives a little better signal-to-noise ratio. Also, because the cranium acts as a low-pass filter for electrical fields, but does not for magnetic fields, you can look at much higher frequencies. So gamma band activity with MEG and not so much with EEG.
What about spatial resolution?
It's about comparable.
Okay, but EEG is dominated by surface. Does MEG go deeper?
No.
No.
No, yeah, so it's pretty similar in that regard. You can't image deep structures with this.
And as you mentioned gamma activity,
Mhm.
are you associating this with one of those frequency bands?
No, this is pretty low frequency. So these are evoked responses. We haven't done a frequency time analysis with these signals, but we should, given that we have the opportunity to look at high frequency bands. Yes.
Have you looked at measuring both simultaneously, the skin conductance and MEG, to see if that decreases?
So some of the subjects are in fact of that nature, that we have MEG and GSR together. We haven't made the correlation yet because it's a subset of these subjects, and with just, I think, 7 or 8 subjects, it's too little for us to get strong correlations. Yeah.
This might sound lame, but while doing this experiments, did you have a look on the physical outer pose of the patients and see a difference of when this fluctuation came in?
When the fluctuation,
Yeah. So like when this was progressing,
Yep.
and you could see these differences between the two groups,
Mhm.
were the external pose of both the groups also showing similar
Huh.
differences?
So we didn't record that. What we did instruct the subjects to do is to stay very still, because MEG is susceptible to movement artifacts. But whether the still pose that they adopted was systematically different between neurotypicals and ASTs, we don't really know. I would suspect not, because we do instruct them in how to sit comfortably, and we give the same instructions to neurotypicals as to ASTs. So sitting comfortably with their arms on the sides. So I would suspect that the poses are fairly comparable, and they maintain their poses through the session. Yeah.
Was the signal completely periodic?
It was completely periodic in this case. Yeah.
And I forgot, how long was it? That's
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Mhm.
You need to have that effect
Yep.
come.
Yep.
And you could vary the predictability of the signal.
Yes,
right?
exactly. So the entrainment work that Sivong is doing, there we are systematically changing the predictability of the sequence. And we are asking people to tap along. But hopefully at some point we'll also gather physiological and electrophysiological data. Yes.
So what about other non-primary auditory areas where you can get some kind of a little response, just to start separating not predictability,
Mhm.
primary sensitivity level, but, gross ability to self-regulate excitability
Yeah.
or something?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that. So we are sitting on a lot of data that we haven't really analyzed. So we haven't looked at the frequency components. We haven't looked at other parts of the brain that might also carry some very valuable information. And here are the groups. So In the black bars are the amplitudes of the evoked responses for the first 50 trials, and in green are the averages for the last 50 trials for each subject. And you notice that for the NTs, that amplitude typically goes down. In going from the black to the green, you see a decrement. For the ASTE participants, you notice that it's the reverse. So again, it seems just amazingly consistent across the subjects. And here is one more. Sorry, was there a question?
I just wondered,
Yes.
is there a difference in the age trend for those two groups?
Yes, so great question. I mean, there does seem to be some effect of age. I mean, we've put them in the order of increasing age, but we don't have enough power here to say something very statistically meaningful. But that would be a great thing to ask. In fact, it's very interesting to ask what happens on this side of the age axis, because it's so easy to record galvanic skin response or even EEG that one can do it with babies. So if this deviation of habituation profiles begins early on in the developmental trajectory, then it could become a risk marker that this child, even prior to the age of diagnosis, is showing signs that they might be at risk. So we have done, or we've started some work with Kasia Chwarska at Yale with exactly that question in mind. How young can we go and still find this deviation? Yes.
Severe is the diagnosis, and are there any other founding diagnoses associated with these individuals besides ASD, such as attention deficit, other things that may
Yeah, so
confound their sensitivity to these auditory cues?
So we have tried to select children for whom ASD was the primary diagnosis. In terms of of how severely affected they were, I would say these would be medium to high functioning, because the requirement of having to sit still for even these 5 to 10 minutes can be quite a challenge for children on the lower functioning end. Yeah.
Disparity between the groups could be much greater if you were able to capture the more severe
Yes,
cohort of
absolutely.
individuals.
Absolutely.
Certainly, you're not, I mean, the diagnoses for these kiddos are generally at like 6 years of age, or are they?
About 2 to 3 years of age.
Even younger.
Yes, yeah.
Could it also be, so if the high function, if it's difficult for people without high functioning autism to sort of sit still for those 5 minutes, is there any possibility that it's still challenging for people with the high functioning to be sitting still for that period of time? That could play something into arousal? It could. Yes, so that we are constraining them so much on this unnatural task that there is some stressor. And that's why we were so interested in getting these direct brain evoked responses. So we thought that if it's some kind of stress-related signal, we would not see it on the auditory cortex. The fact that we are seeing it at the level of the auditory cortex seems to suggest, it doesn't rule out the factor that you're pointing out, but it seems to suggest that this might not be entirely driven by stress. So then we moved on from MEG to EEG, because we have an EEG system right in my lab.
That's the greatest motivation in the world.
Right. So when people ask, how are you using that $100,000 that you had requested us for, we can say something meaningful. Okay, so the same kind of presentation protocol, 1 minute of silent baseline followed by 5 minutes of metronomic tones. Okay. So here is an NT individual, NT child, and what you're seeing here are the trials stacked one on top of the other, time progressing that way.
And you notice that the power or the amplitude of that peak is decreasing as time is progressing. So this is a neurotypical. And you can do this averaging across multiple trials, do a running average as the trials progress, and you notice that there is habituation that the NT is exhibiting. With an ASD individual, you see kind of like what we saw with MEG, a lack of habituation as the trials progress.
And the variance is larger too.
And the variance is larger, yes. Yeah, so that is something that we have observed both with the GSR data and the electrophysiological data, and we don't quite know what to make of that yet. We are just looking at the overall trend, but there may be information in the variance. And here are the auditory habituation slopes of individual subjects. And you notice, again, akin to the MEG results, most of the NT subjects are showing negative slopes. Some are showing positive slopes, while most of the ASD subjects are showing positive slopes. So one question that was often asked of us was, is this phenomenon of atypical habituation, is that specific to audition, or might this be a pan-modality phenomenon? So might you observe this also in other sensory modalities? And that's an important question to ask so that we can judge whether this reduced habituation is a general phenomenon. So here is habituation in the visual domain. Now, instead of beeps, we are presenting these radial checkerboards with the same time dynamics, so one every second. And here again, we find that the NT subjects show habituation and the ASDs do not. And these are the groups. So we created a composite sensory score where we averaged the slopes for the auditory and the visual protocols. So this is the composite sensory score for NTs and for ASDs. And now with these scores, we could do some analyses of how correlated these scores were with the clinical scores that these children had been assigned. So the clinical scores came from these clinical instruments, the social and communication questionnaire, the child behavior checklist, and this sensory profile. So the relationship between CSR scores, the composite sensory score, and the social and communication questionnaire. These are standard questionnaires used to clinically characterize children on the spectrum. And interestingly enough, we find pretty significant correlations between what we are observing with our sensory habituation tests and these clinical scores. And I wouldn't go into the details other than just to point out that you're seeing these significant correlations across most of these clinical scores.
Just
Yeah.
one thing, there is this silly vent there. Can you try and speak up
Louder?
more? I'm just
Sure.
thinking of the people in the back.
Yes. Sorry about that.
We
Yeah.
have no control over that vent.
Yes. I will.
I know, you did, he taught 4.5 hours before this, so.
We can habituate to that.
Yes.
I'm not sure if it's a good idea to ask questions now or.
Oh, please. Yeah, feel free to ask.
You mentioned that you would like to switch to different channels except auditory one.
Mm-hmm.
But earlier there was also evidence that they might hear in different frequency ranges than human. That ASD children might perceive different frequencies. Was there any study performed to study habituation and sensitization for different frequencies than 250 Hertz?
So my understanding of that literature is that those reports have not really stood the test of further experimentation. That is, a child with autism is not going to be sensitive beyond the 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz range. It's not that they are going to be hearing 25 kilohertz while neurotypicals can't. They have the same range.
Agreed, but
Yeah.
within the regular range,
Yeah.
Do you know if there were any studies in audio perception, but at different frequencies?
I don't really know. They might well be, but I'm not aware of them. So just to summarize, Sivong, would you like some water? To summarize, GSR, MEG, and EEG data suggest reduced habituation in ASD. And this kind of endogenous problems with prediction that might be causing this reduction in habituation, they get some support from some entrainment work that we did with neurotypical and ASD participants. So it's a completely different line of investigation. There, what we are asking subjects to do is just follow along to a sequence of beeps that they're hearing. So what you're seeing here are data from NTs in blue and ASDs in red. And these are the latencies beyond the actual occurrence of the beep. And you notice that the NTs are pretty close to 0, or they're pretty close to 2 seconds. So this was a sequence that had a periodicity of 2 seconds. So they seem to be beautifully entrained, and they've captured the periodicity of the sequence. Whereas individuals with autism seem to be much more variable in terms of when they are pressing the key. So I know that this is a stretch to say that this is what they're hearing. When they're hearing a periodic sequence, we don't know whether they're hearing it as an aperiodic sequence, but at least in their production, it seems to be that they are producing aperiodic responses.
You didn't look at this as a function of frequency, did you? Because you meant.
Yeah. So as a function of the time interval between the beeps, we are doing that now. So these are all data from about 6 years ago. The work that Sivong is doing on entrainment now, that systematically looks at different periodicities and deviations from periodicity. Yes.
So there are two things here. One is hearing an auditory signal, but the other is a motor task of pushing a button. And how do you partition between them? And if you do, is there any age correlation or lack of it?
Yeah. So
with the particular motor task?
with these data, we can't partition between the hearing and the production. But one hope that we are holding out with this new line of work, Sivong, we are putting more and more pressure on this new line of research yielding remarkable insights, is that if we are able to record EEG while the person is listening to the sequence of beeps, then the evoked responses to the beeps, without the requirement of production, the regularity of those evoked responses might give us some indication of what they're hearing. And whether that correlates with the accuracy of production, that would be interesting to see. So we don't have that yet, but we are after it.
Just another way to, which is still motor, but is to use the vocal apparatus. That wouldn't involve,
I see.
The problem of maybe agitated limb movements, but just voice it and then use a microphone, and to use the onset of the microphone as a way of timing the response.
So is it known that that entrainment is more accurate than the tapping entrainment?
No, not that I'm aware of.
But it would be
I just
interesting.
thought,
Yep.
right, if
A different aspect of the
Yeah,
motor
yeah,
system. Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
Another thing is also with children with autism or individuals with autism, there are all those stereotypes, repetitive movements, and how do you also take into account a certain resonance frequency of those stereotypes with the frequency of your stimuli?
Tapping. Yeah, I don't really know. But one thing that's been suggested to us is that prior to starting the entrainment study, we just have a person tap just to their internal beat. So we are not giving them an external sound sequence. We're just asking them to tap, and we try to determine what is the most comfortable tapping frequency for them, and that perhaps is their internal
So they
beat.
tap
At their
You
preferred
don't
frequency.
define
We don't, right,
parameters.
right, right. Yeah.
So how are you interpreting, right, these findings about the responses to rhythms, right? So, you started out raising the question of sensitivity,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Paul,
the
can you
issue-
speak
and
up?
then-
You're always.
Then the issue of habituation, right, and the confounding issue is the perception of the rhythm, right? So there are mechanisms for detecting and learning rhythm. This is a very simple rhythm. So is it that one can learn the rhythm and the other can't? Is that something that's possible?
Yes. So my simple-minded,
Why would
yeah.
you expect to see, and if it were rhythm, why would you expect to see it at a relatively peripheral, first order cortical, at least, relay, where some of that processing is thought to,
Mm-hmm.
take time, although, there's feedback affects the primary cortex.
So I'm not certain how immune the responses over the auditory cortex are to higher order influences. So even though these are auditory evoked responses, they may well be influenced at least by so that would be my understanding.
So just sorry.
But that's to say that the issue remains.
Mhm.
Is it, sensitivity to isolated, repeated events, or is it something to do with learning the rhythm or not learning the rhythm? If you're saying that
Right. And it would be the latter that I would hypothesize is at work here. So it's not the sensitivity to the individual items, but rather not being able to perceive the rhythm, not being able to predict when the next event is going to transpire, and thereby not being able to habituate to it.
So as you mentioned, different frequencies.
Yeah.
And you should know that, but so 2 seconds is beyond what is usually performed
Yes, it's
smoothly and
right.
rhythmically. So you're stretching that time horizon to really, even for neurotypical adults, that it becomes difficult to maintain that 2-second interval. Whereas 1 second or 500 milliseconds gets very easy.
Yeah.
And I would venture to say that it is no longer prediction in those short intervals, but rather entrainment of the neuromechanical substrate. So then, if I were right, then the differences between NT and ASD should diverge
The longer you make this. Yeah.
and
That,
maybe even the same for the short preferred intervals.
yes. I completely agree with that. And in fact, that's why we are so keen to try out spanning this the space of the intervals. I think the smallest that we're using is 0.75 or 0.75 seconds for the entrainment, and going up to about 2 seconds.
Right,
Yeah.
I would even go shorter, because
Even shorter?
500 milliseconds and sort of 400 are still used in
I
that
see.
literature, and 2 hertz is very frequently the preferred rhythm.
I see. Okay. Yes, please.
Is there any merit in asking these two groups to
maintain their own metronome, like, I don't know, doing a drum beat
Mhm.
and checking how well they're able to.
Yes, so
You teach them at different rates and then see how well they maintain.
yeah, so we are doing exactly that. So there's a period of entrainment. So the person is listening to a sequence of beeps, and we're asking them to tap along to it. Then at some point, those beeps stop, and the person has to recreate that same texture of sound that they were hearing. And there are many interesting questions there, even aside from autism. So if you don't have a perfectly periodic sequence, so let's say the distribution of the interbeep intervals follows, say, a normal distribution that we are picking from. In your reconstruction, are you able to recreate that same distribution, or are there systematic errors that you make? So we are trying to ask many of those questions, and I think looking at that developmentally in the purely neurotypical arena, and then also asking the question of, do NTs differ from ASDs? They would all be interesting. Okay, so just to carry on with the summary. So the GSR, MEG, EEG data suggest reduced habituation in ASD. The psychological symptomology and habituation appear to be related. So this is the correlation between our habituation results and the clinical scores. This result has implications for accounting for sensory hypersensitivities and also obsessive interests. So you can imagine this cutting both ways. If you don't habituate to a stimulus, then it can become aversive. So a stimulus that has some negative valence can become even more negative as time progresses. But if you are attracted to a stimulus and you don't habituate to it, then you might exhibit an obsessive interest in that stimulus. So this reduction in habituation might be able to account for both of these kinds of phenomena. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to bring in the predictability
Mhm.
again, because I could easily, if you take your second bullet point, this is
Yep.
talking habituation for you. Well, then you say it's habituation is a proxy for predictability. So is it the lack of habituation and the continued high response that actually is upsetting kids, or is that just a
Manifestation,
sign
yeah.
of the inability to predict, which then has some consequence?
Yes, so I would say that it's the predictability that's the crux, and habituation is a manifestation, or a reduction in habituation is the manifestation of that.
So another question.
Yes.
On the previous slide,
Mhm.
you started to discuss the right-hand side, and we interrupted you. Did you want to go back to that?
Oh, this is, so it's kind of a retelling of this. So proportion of key presses within plus minus 50 milliseconds of auditory tone. NTs have many more presses. ASDs have fewer proportion within that small time window. And we tried out a few different conditions, random tones where, of course, you can't do a very good job on that. Two hands simultaneously, people doing this, two hands alternately. So we were just trying a few different conditions. Okay. All right. So that was part of our empirical battery, the perceptual processing. Then we move on to dynamic interception, and this is the beautiful work that Dagmar has been doing. So interacting with dynamic objects, and I almost feel scared about talking about dynamic interception to this audience, because I know almost nothing about it, and I'm presenting work that really Dagmar and Siwong have done. So what's needed to track a moving object? Prediction, because if you are trying to estimate the position in the moment, then you would constantly lag behind the object. And this graphic that you'd seen earlier can be transposed to the case of prediction by saying, well, if you see what the position of the object is and where it is a little while later, you eventually are able to predict just seeing where that object is, and you can say where it will be. So the PIA hypothesis predicts that interactions with dynamic objects will be challenging for individuals on the spectrum. Is that really the case? Anecdotally, that seems to be the case. Here is a quote from a community page for autism. So this person who's on the spectrum says, throwing a ball was not a problem. However, I couldn't catch a ball until I was age 13. And this refrain occurs across many accounts that I've seen, that catching a ball just seems to be very difficult and it causes problems on the playground. This is a gratuitous video of my son and one of his friends playing catch. And I used this video, I'll show it because I promised Darius that he will get a showing at Northeastern. So, so this was from a few years ago. So this beautiful predictive movement of preparing to catch a ball, which is so evident in neurotypical children. If you compare that to this child's behavior, so this is Walter, and I have permission to share this video from Walter's mother, Margaret Kelgard. So Walter is on the spectrum. Margaret is throwing the ball to Walter, and when the ball comes straight into Walter's arms, he's able to catch it. But otherwise, if there's any kind of deviation away from right into his hands or arms, it's difficult for him. Yes?
So you talk about this being the inability to predict perhaps B given A,
Mm-hmm.
but what about also just the ability to estimate A, or the concurrent state of the ball, right? So for example, if it's flying and it disappears, can subjects perhaps pinpoint how accurately can they actually estimate where the ball is?
Yeah.
Besides just B given A.
So some of the control studies that Dagmar and Sivong have done have tried to get at that question. Is it just a matter of spatial localization being erroneous, or is it just a matter of the responses being generally slower? And that seems not to be the case.
So I did see in your first slide, there was one point saying that they don't point with index finger. I don't know what you mean, but when you showed all the definitions of autism, there was an index finger comment that they don't use index finger point.
Right. So I don't know whether that can be linked to spatial localization, but that feature, it is a fairly prominent feature of autism, that children with autism would, instead of saying, look at that, they would rather take their parent's arm or their caregiver's arm and bring them to the object. And it's not quite understood why that is. I mean, this finger pointing happens quite spontaneously in young children. I mean, I was looking out for this behavior in Darius, and indeed, by about 2 years of age, I could see that he's pointing. And for some reason, it doesn't start in autism. So we were curious about these anecdotal reports in autism about the difficulty of intercepting dynamic objects. So a few years ago, we decided to get some more traction on this question by creating our home-brewed version of this old video game called Pong from Atari. So we, or one of the students in the lab, created a MATLAB version of Pong, and we had children play Pong while we tracked their eyes. So this is, oops. Here is a video of a neurotypical child playing Pong. So the child is controlling the paddle with their mouse, and instead of playing against an adversary, they're just playing by themselves, and their goal is to try to prevent this ball from escaping the room. the red traces correspond to where they're looking. And what's interesting to note, again, this is a neurotypical child, is how anticipatory the eye movements are. Even before a ball gets to a certain point, the child is already looking where the ball is going to impact. Next, we will look at a child with autism playing Pong. And here it's interesting to note that instead of anticipating where the ball is going to be, the child keeps following where the ball has been.
We tried gaze contingent Pong.
We haven't tried gaze contingent Pong.
It does work.
Huh.
The thing about it that might be a confound here is you have coordination between a sensory and a motor system happening in a way that are kind of mushed into the same set of data, like if you're controlling the powers of the eye movement, right? And I didn't know whether or not you could check to see whether doing so forced kids on the spectrum to make the same kind of interesting.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I will reach out to you about that. Okay. And you can analyze these eye movement paths, and indeed we find that there are many more leading gazes in green than lagging gazes, whereas in autism there are many more lagging gazes. So, encouraged by these preliminary results, when we came into Dagmar's orbit, and Dagmar said, hey, one can be much more sophisticated in doing these kinds of studies, we decided that the time was right to undertake some more interesting studies, more rigorous studies. So in Dagmar's lab, and this is really going to be a very high-level description of Dagmar's work. So in Dagmar's lab, which has several Qualisys cameras around the ceiling, so you can, with great spatial and temporal resolution, record the movement of the projectile, the movement of the ball, and the movement of the child's hands. We have children try to catch balls launched from a ball launcher. So in order to take away any of the social components of the catch task, we have this ping pong ball launcher, and the child has to reach out and try to catch it. And the child is wearing these reflective markers so that we can track their movements. So we can, of course, look at the velocity of the hand as a function of the time since launch. And it's interesting that there is some delay in the initiation of the actions. We are also recording, or Dagmar and Siwong are also recording EMG, and there seems to be some evidence to suggest that the beautiful choreography of muscle movements, of muscle activity that is evident in NTs seems not to be as evident in ASD individuals.
So just before the catching
Yes.
movement in the previous one, in the red lines, what is that big fat pink blobs?
Yes, so this is where the child makes contact with the ball.
Can I ask you?
Yes, please.
So you said that the launching machine was provided as a launching machine and not a human being to avoid social interaction.
Mhm.
But like having, I don't know, a robot or their mother launching the ball would have affect their performance? Like this social
It could
impairment
have.
does affect their
There's
performance?
the risk that it might affect.
Okay.
So if we were playing catch, I could read from your face, or there's at least the possibility that I could read from your face when you are about to throw the ball to me. So it would give me some preparatory cues. And we wanted to avoid that. Okay, so in terms of throwing versus catching, this anecdote that we had read that throwing was not a problem, catching was, Dagmar and Siwong find that indeed there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between neurotypicals and autistics on the throwing task, but there is in the catching task.
And what was the task in the throwing task?
So what's the task, Siwong?
It's a virtual throwing game that I think Dagmar this time explained about the skills game.
They have to throw the ball through an
yeah,
orifice or through certain locations?
Yeah, through, so the big red circle is representing the center post of a skills game, and the yellow one is a target. So you're asked to hit the target by moving your arm. Okay.
And then there are quite a few experiments in a virtual setting. So they combine physical and virtual worlds. The child is able to manipulate this paddle that's connected to a sensor, so you can sense the position of the paddle, but the child is actually manipulating the position of this basket to catch a ball that's being thrown, and it disappears behind the trees. So the child has to be prepared to bring the paddle up at the right time in order to catch the ball. Or the child has to intercept this ball at the right time so it shows up in the window. Or the child has to predict which of these three mice will get the ball of cheese being thrown at the house. And then there are control conditions where the child simply has to bring up this net to catch a mouse and as quickly as possible so that the mouse doesn't get too much of the cheese. So that's a basic reaction time task. You can't predict when the mouse is going to appear next. How quickly can you move the net? So Dagmar and Siwong have collected a lot of data, both in lab and also in the Museum of Science. So these serve as normative data against which to compare the data that we're getting from ASD individuals, ASD children. So with the interception task, the number of trees that intervene between the launcher and the net, these can vary from 1 to 3, so increasing the amount of predictive stress that the child needs to address. And the results so far suggest that as the amount of occlusion increases, the error that children on the spectrum are exhibiting increases, while children, neurotypical children, seem not to be affected. With this interception, where the child has to press the button at exactly the right time to capture the ball within the window. And this cannot be a reactive task, because if you were to wait to see the ball and then press the button, the ball is traveling fast enough that it will move away from the window. So there, it seems that neurotypical children perform better when the window over which they have to predict is shorter. So there are two ball speeds, fast and slow, and neurotypical children are a little better in the fast condition than in the slow condition, whereas autistic children do not show any benefits to having the window of prediction shortened. I know that I'm not doing justice with the descriptions, but any questions that you have, we can discuss, and I can point to Dagmar and Siwong to address them. And then with the interception predicting which of the three mice will get the cheese, neurotypical children are equally good across all three mice. Children with autism seem to perform reasonably well with the top mouse, but then perform progressively worse for the lower two mice. So it seems that so long as the trajectory of the ball is going up, the child with autism just predicts that it's the topmost mouse that's going to get the cheese. And they can't seem to predict that they could be the lower mice as well that might get this cheese.
I think they just extrapolate where the ball disappears
Mhm.
or the cheese disappears.
Yep.
And in the blue case, the blue bottom mouse,
Yep.
they really need to perceive the
The
trajectory
downward trend of
that
the, yep.
ballistic curve, and there is a discrepancy between where the cheese disappears behind the house and reappears.
Yes.
Are your NT to ASD groups matched across socioeconomic, educational, home factors? Are these additional factors taken into account?
So we have done a reasonably good job of matching. In fact, that's why the N's that we have are fairly small, because we are trying to match them on as many factors as possible: IQ, age for sure, gender.
And are you aware of any, is it noted other cognitive deficits that the ASD children have besides?
So yes, so again, we are trying to be fairly selective to have children only have an autism diagnosis and not have other neurological conditions. Yes.
Is it clear to what degree the children, the kids with ASD, see the house, the scenes as being representative of real world scenario where, oh, there's supposed to be gravity, so that should be a curved trajectory rather than just keep going up?
That's an interesting question. I don't have a way to answer that, whether they are in fact representing these as real world, as representations of real world objects. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
All I know is in our very minimalistic virtual environments, human subjects don't seem to have to familiarize themselves with the fact that there is gravity and and that there is contact. It seems to be a relatively immediate mapping onto the physical world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whether ASD children do it in the same way, I don't know.
Yeah. I
Have
don't
they
know.
shown examples of the movement like without the house, right? So do they ever do the task without the house?
Not without the house, but
Because that would at least allow them to, then you can say that
Mm-hmm.
they're exposed to what the physics are and how it's going to react, and now we're covering it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, they didn't try the task, without the house. But I think when we introduced the game, we showed the actual trajectory of the ball without the house. They actually know that it's supposed to be like a projectile. So
there's a very elaborate explanation before each of the games in stepwise manner, pre-recorded, to make sure that they get all the elements of the game.
But the conclusion will remain same, right? They can't predict even if they. I mean,
Yeah, even if
nobody
it's
can
unusual
parallel
physics, right,
trajectory while
right,
catching it.
right.
It's something we do, so the conclusion
That's right.
remains same. It doesn't
Right.
matter whether they
Right.
get the physics of.
Yeah.
So you've showed prediction errors with vision and hearing.
Mhm.
What happens with touch?
So we have just taken baby steps, and I had one slide that I then took out. We have a device that can deliver taps to the fingertips, and we're finding similar results there as well. But we just don't have enough subjects on that. Yes.
You had some sort of cross-sectional developmental data for the earlier auditory and visual slides. Do you have that for this yet? Like how many would you have like 7 to 27 or something?
So yeah, so Sivong has a manuscript in preparation, which is looking at developmental profiles in neurotypicals. So how do these abilities develop in neurotypical children? I don't think we have enough children to ask the same question in autism yet.
Yeah, I mean, I can save it for later, but the trend was the differences diminished
Mm-hmm.
in the other ones.
Yeah.
And so I was going to ask later,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
a
yeah.
developmentalist,
Hmm.
what does that mean to you?
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Does using MEG, ECG while the time they are playing the game explain if they are actually trying hard to understand the trajectory and failing it, or we could not use it? Yeah.
Couldn't use it. I mean, that would quite be a heroic experiment if one could do it. So there are just so many motion-related artifacts that you would pick up if you were recording EEG while the child was doing this, that it would be very, very hard to analyze the signals.
A paper out by a former collaborator of mine who has also worked on that throwing game, right? The Skittles game, as we call it, and using EEG for 20-year-old college students. And what he found is that one of those EEG waves predicts the error. So just upon release of the ball in this sort of single joint throwing movement, just upon the release of the ball, there is one of these potentials that correlates with the subsequent error, predicting the error.
Interesting. Do you know what kind of EEG headset they were wearing? Was it an emotive, so a wireless EEG unit?
I don't know. I can look it up.
But yeah, that would be very interesting to find out. Yes.
Sorry. So, have you evaluated their proprioception? So how well they know where their limb is in space? Has that been controlled, or are you seeing their perception of where their limb is, and they're just position either out, and do they have a way of matching the other limb to give us some sense of their internal understanding of their limb and where it is in space?
Indeed, indeed. So we have a test for precisely that, right?
We have 4 hours behavioral testing and then another 2 hours control
so
test
the proprioception
in the lab.
is okay?
Not the one that you mentioned, that is blind matching of joint angles, one of those. But I think, Sibong, say the one test I just remember is catching a static ball as fast as possible. So standing in front of it and then catch the ball. And we have mountains of data, and I don't have them ready. But the idea is, and I don't quite know the result, but I think we did have results, right?
We only have results for the reaction time and movement time, like speed of the movement, which doesn't show any difference between those NT and AST.
That's a control experiment for the real catching, where the ball is moving. So we did a catching with a static ball to see whether, including as fast as possible, reaction time tests, no difference. And then, but that involves bringing your hand as fast as possible to a spatial target, which is, I would say, involves proprioception. It's not the typical test, but it's part and parcel of it. Visually guided action of the limb.
There is a reasonably rigorous literature on proprioception in neurotypicals in kids with autism, and not a convincing difference.
Right. So yeah, that was
Not a convincing difference.
Thank you.
Got it.
Okay,
I
so
think that's as much, Annie has done more clinical, batteries of clinical tests, 4 hours of clinical testing.
yes, please.
Is there any evidence going back to like very, very early in development of proprioceptive versus automotor differences? Because one thing that could be happening is that, if this is a difficulty in the learned response because they're not habituating, they're not getting the information up to build a better model, it could be that you're not seeing differences between neurotypical and ASD because they have their body with them every single moment. And so even though habituation is difficult, they built maybe a good model by that point. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know if there's any evidence of it, but that would be interesting to look at as an early marker.
It would. Yeah, so the only early, I hesitate to call it a marker, but the only result that I'm reminded of is poor muscle tone in children who are at risk for autism. So when you go to pick up a neurotypical baby, they stiffen their muscles in order to be picked up, and a child with autism does not. Now, that has just been left to the level of observation that this happens, but I don't believe any kind of explanatory account has been offered about it. And I wonder whether that might be an anticipatory aspect to behavior.
At what age is that evident?
So this is a few months of age. Yeah.
It's 6 months.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes.
In this, when you have 3 mice experiment, is there the top-bottom differentiation, or there is a preferred height of the top mouse? You know, they're just going for a certain height, or is it between the positioning of mice?
So our thinking is that these 3 trajectories, the visible sections of these 3 trajectories are all upwards, and that is what is inducing children with autism to pick the top mouse. So instead of seeing that they would eventually be a downward trend, they're just seeing this upward trend. So I believe in height is that explanation does rely upon the height of the 3 mice. So if you had all 3 mice up here, then I would think that they would indiscriminately pick between those 3 mice. That would be my guess.
So currently we haven't varied.
Yeah.
Didn't vary.
No.
Yeah, we didn't vary.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I was collecting data, I asked one child, like, how actually they did it, and it's actually Darius. He said, actually the top one is just because you can just detect the trial where the ball is highest. And that's obviously.
I see. Yeah.
But he was struggling to distinguish between the middle and bottom one.
I see.
Even for neurotypical individuals, actually, as you can see, the bottom one is slightly less.
Yep.
Because they have to really think about they really have to extrapolate the trajectory, and especially for the bottom one, which is the blue trajectory, it's really goes down to the bottom, but you're actually tempted to judge that goes to the middle, the green one, because if you just directly compare
the height here is right.
it's actually closer to the green mouse. So the task itself is quite tricky, and I mean we should have kind of varied
the overall height of the combination. Yeah. I agree.
Do that, but
I agree.
But I think the task itself tells us the differential difficulty of each trajectory.
So did you give them a reward or a success signal of any kind, or?
We give them like feedback, but whether it's successful or.
Because that's also a question of, is it about building a predictive model versus just the ability to learn or build a model versus just simply the ability
They get
to.
a flashing mouse.
Yep.
Correct.
Also, it could be the switch, the red button is right on the top, it could be how much they can turn the fingers, could that also have an influence?
When you press the button?
Is that red button correlated with?
Yeah, so the red button is correlated with the red mouse.
Tap like that, and I can very well tap like that.
Perhaps,
Well,
yeah.
We
You should
in
switch
the
the colors and then
museum
confirm.
we didn't have the 3 mice, but we
Then-
just used keys on the keyboard,
And
and
still same result?
yeah.
Yeah, well, that gives them like real complexity of the game, and they might not even understand what's going on here. So that might be too difficult for except 12-year-olds. But I mean, because even this kind of game, it's not easy to understand.
All right. So I want to make sure that, my goodness. Okay. So I will Yeah, so the reaction time is pretty much the same between the two groups. So it's not just a generalized slowing of one group relative to the other. So to summarize, in physical as well as virtual settings, children with autism exhibit reduced performance relative to NTs as predictive requirements of the interception tasks are increased, and these impairments are unlikely to arise from a generalized slowing of responses. So instead of going through the probabilistic reasoning, I want to use these last few minutes in a more self-serving manner. So Dagmar had mentioned Project Prakash, and I want to get some of your advice. So that those few minutes, I'm not going to be throwing data at you, but rather soliciting your suggestions. But let me conclude this and then take a few minutes to talk about Prakash, because we really do need some help regarding understanding motor behavior in those children. So I'm skipping through the probabilistic reasoning slides. Nouchine will be upset. But so this is where we are starting to do fMRI with the children as well. But okay, so far the results that we have, the empirical results that we are observing, and the empirical results that we are seeing from other labs that have been influenced by this hypothesis seem to be quite encouraging. I mean, not all of them are positive, but I would say the majority seem to be supportive. What are the concerns that we have about this hypothesis? And I'm sure many of you also share those concerns. So here are some of the concerns. First, at the moment, it's just too broad. It also appears to be inconsistent with the observed heterogeneity of autism. I mean, it's often said, when you've seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism. So how is it that this kind of an overarching hypothesis can account for the heterogeneity of the condition? It seems to be inconsistent with reports of savant abilities, people who are just amazingly capable of doing certain things. How can this very basic impairment be consistent with savant skills? And the specificity to autism is unclear. Is this particularly related to autism, or might other conditions also lead to impairments?
Aren't the savant more about memory and?
Yes, very good. Yes, so I'm going to. Excellent. So you're making my point for me. It's a wonderful audience. So I'm going to go through what our current thinking is as to how we think the PIA might respond to each one of these concerns. So the PIA is too broad. That's a legitimate concern. So isn't saying that a person has impaired prediction kind of like saying that he has difficulty breathing? I mean, everything is going to be compromised. So are there any functions that we might expect to be spared if a person has predictive impairments? So tasks that minimize the need for prediction are the ones that are rule-based or static. So things like mathematics or copying pictures or block reconstruction or calendar calculations. And these are the kinds of skills that individuals with autism excel at often. So the islands of proficiency seem to be consistent. Yes?
In what sense do those tasks not employ prediction?
Sorry?
In what sense do those tasks not employ prediction?
So if you learn a rule once, then you can just apply that rule. There is no uncertainty as to the outcome.
It's more backward looking, right? If I was there, then I go there,
Yes.
as opposed to I see something ahead of me, and
Yep.
therefore I.
But the prediction is not time contingent, right? Like in all the previous ones,
Mhm.
something the prediction involves getting something in the profile of time.
Yes.
Mathematics, I mean, I can take 2 minutes extra to solve an equation of 1
Yeah.
hour more.
Yeah, and it's very deterministic.
And in particular for higher mathematics,
Mhm.
a certain that's the point. That, like, that you don't need prediction of the kinds he showed for doing that.
Lots of higher mathematics converted on logic too. And logic is a rule-guided system that has unambiguous outcomes based on the application of.
They're only unambiguous once you do them, though.
Okay.
We can, just to go straight to the point, we can program a computer to
Mhm.
point out 1,000 groups per minute, but that doesn't tell it which ones are useful to search. That's still a prediction problem. And real mathematicians don't, real mathematicians exercise their predictive faculties in searching for a good proof for the right theorem, rather than rigidly manipulating symbols.
Right. So it would be interesting to ask individuals who are on the spectrum and are good mathematicians, in what way are they good mathematicians? Is it some kinds of mathematical skills that they excel at and some others that prove to be challenging for them? That would certainly be an interesting exercise to undertake. Yeah. Yeah.
So another way, what that was me think to follow up with is that another thing that you could say about the rule-based static systems is that there's a lot less noise in those systems as well too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if you see, like I know you cited the Van de Cruys paper of where they think of autism as being more difficulty in separating out signal from noise, but I'm wondering if you think that there's some overlap in explanation, or maybe the fact that you're seeing lack of habituation, if that could be another mechanism leading to having trouble separating signal from noise as well too.
Yeah, so I would tend to interpret noise as just adding more non-determinism to the system. So if the noise is unpredictable, then that relationship between event A and event B becomes that much weaker. So I would fold it into the same general framework. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know why it happens that way, that some autists might get improved or much increased empathy towards animals?
So I don't know whether it's empathy, but they certainly they feel more comfortable interacting with larger animals than, sorry?
Sorry, excuse me.
So horse riding, yeah, Temple Grandin is. So Temple Grandin is a person with autism. She lives in Denver, I believe, and she holds some faculty appointment in the Department of Animal Husbandry, I think at the University of Colorado, if I'm not mistaken. And she feels that she can understand the mental state. I'm not being facetious, but she has used her skills and her understanding of the mind of say cows and such to create better abattoirs, slaughterhouses where the cows don't feel as stressed as they're about to be killed off. So honestly, I don't really know enough about this domain to even hazard a guess, but the little literature that I've read is that larger animals seem to be the ones that children and adults with autism tend to feel more comfortable with, and the smaller animals that have more of these darting-like movements, those they don't feel as comfortable with. Now, whether that's related to greater predictability in the behavior of, say, horses and cows, I don't know.
My idea was that being able to understand animals better after I thought of the temple might actually help those people to predict movements of animals. Probably, I know they might be rhythmic if we consider different gaits, but still probably they will be able to predict curve trajectories of joints movements or something like that of animals, unlike such objects as balls. probably there might be something different in prediction of live objects dynamics. Just
Possibly, that's an intriguing thought. Yeah.
But if you want
Okay.
to get to your project,
All right,
go
I'm just going to.
ahead.
Yes, yes, please.
Are there any like savants in animation versus simply drawing? Right.
Yeah. Are there savants in animation? I don't know, but let me bring up that point. Hold that thought. In 2 slides, I'll get to that. So the second concern that we have, and I'm presenting these counter arguments not to suggest that we have completely alleviated these concerns, but rather just to indicate how we are thinking about alleviating these concerns. So this notion of PIA being inconsistent with the observed heterogeneity of autism. If this is the nature of the impairment, that there's the shift of the association sensitivity function to the up and left, shouldn't all cases of autism look alike? Which is patently not the case. So one possible addressal of this concern is that different tasks occupy different zones in the space. Based on where you have the greatest shift, you might end up with different kinds of phenotypes. So for instance, if you have a shift mostly in this section, then maybe it's going to manifest as more of a language compromise. If you have shift mostly in the latter section, it might be more planning compromise. This might be a more broad-based compromise. So what we are not suggesting is that there's this uniform shift of the function to the up and left, but rather there can be different kinds of shifts. And then to your question about savantism and PIA being inconsistent with instance of savant abilities. So just as you were pointing out, typical savant abilities are calendar calculations, music, and memorization. And these are just the argument that we had made earlier, that these are more memory-based skills rather than being prediction-based skills. So to the best of my knowledge, I have not heard of baseball or soccer superstars or people who are savants and are good animation experts.
I was surprised about music because that's the one that does involve a temporal, has a strong temporal factor.
Yes, so what I have seen, and please correct me if this is in error, what I've seen is that individuals with autism are able to reproduce the musical pieces that they've heard really beautifully, but improvisation seems to be more of a challenge for them.
Jazz, for example.
Yeah, I haven't seen, yeah. And then PIA's specificity to autism is unclear, and this is a completely valid concern. We haven't really alleviated this in any way. We need to characterize predictive abilities of children with other cognitive challenges, be it Down's, specific language impairment, Williams syndrome, to determine whether they are some atypicalities unique to autism. So to summarize, here's what we talked about, the hypothesis and its motivation, and that's the PIA, the magical world hypothesis. What we like about this hypothesis is its ability, potentially, to explain multiple aspects of the condition and its consistency with the empirical data that we have gathered and that many other labs have gathered too. What we dislike about the hypothesis is primarily the breadth. We need to make it more specific. And the planned work is just further tests of the PIA and its refinement. One big shot of encouragement for us in pursuing this hypothesis is the feedback that we have gotten, not just from the scientists, but also from families. So the autism community is very active in terms of keeping track of the current research. We've heard from many parents of children with autism, and the feedback has been remarkably positive. And I put a great store by those kinds of observations from the parents, because they are the ones who are really seeing this condition all the time. I mean, as scientists, we are getting brief vignettes of this condition. So when a parent says that this hypothesis seems to make sense to me, I find that very, very encouraging. Here is a quote from a family in Texas. So I recently read an article about your hypothesis of prediction as it pertains to autism. It has helped me make sense of all that we are living through every day. We would like to be a part of your work to help put the theory through its paces. So this is very encouraging to be able to bring the science that we're doing in the lab to families. And with that, let me conclude and thank everybody who has been involved with the work, and to you for your attention even to 7 p.m. on a Thursday night. So thank you for this.